Hello, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by two special guests, Lisa Wolfe and Rodney Brazil. A while back, Lisa wrote an article for the magazine about a one-man play that Rodney has been performing about the book of Ecclesiastes. We are going to talk a lot about that show and the performance. But before we do that, would love for our listeners to learn who the two of you are. So, Lisa, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am professor of Hebrew Bible at Oklahoma City University. We are a United Methodist affiliated liberal arts university in Oklahoma City. Obviously, I'm also ordained clergy in the United Church of Christ and an author.
That's great. Thanks for joining us. And Rodney, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yes, my name is Rodney Brazil. I also live in Oklahoma City, and I'm an actor and director and playwright. And I mostly work here in Oklahoma City, but for the last 2 years, I've been touring the show Meaningless around the United States, and I'm excited to do it here in Oklahoma City again.
That's great. Well, I'm just going to turn it over to Lisa so the two of you can chat a little bit about Meaningless.
Well, this all started with a wonderful person who decided to audit my Hebrew class, Roberta Sloan, who's the director of Jewish Theater of Oklahoma. And in the course of being a student in my Hebrew class, and she learned my interest in the book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, its Hebrew title. I had just finished a book on Ecclesiastes, a commentary for the Wisdom Commentary series. So she knew I was very interested, and probably I mentioned it in every class session. So she knew that Rodney was doing this one man show of Ecclesiastes because he had been her student. She had worked with him in various capacities. And so she said, Lisa, you've got to see this show. And I was so excited at the whole idea, partly because over the many years that I've been working on Kohelet, one of the things I often would say is, wow, I just don't know how to take this line. I wish I could see the look on Kohelet's face. And so this was my chance. So I hurried up and bought a ticket, and I got to see the show in Oklahoma City. And I sat in the second row, and I was just entranced. So the thing that was always of interest to me as a question for Rodney was, why did you do this? And how did you find this book? Because so many people I talk with are pretty unfamiliar with Ecclesiastes other than the chapter 3 lyrics from the Pete Seeger song.
Sure, sure. Well, I was at the time I'd been through a personal tragedy, and I was really reading a lot of books and really kind of like doing the whole search for answers thing. And I was listening to a podcast, and somebody in the podcast said Ecclesiastes, that most controversial book of the Bible. And I was kind of laying in bed, and I thought, well, what's so controversial? I've never heard that Ecclesiastes is controversial. And I just made a mental note to read it, and then the next day I remembered my mental note, and I got up and read it. And I just couldn't believe what I was reading. It was as if I never knew some of these ideas existed in the Bible. And so I read it a couple more times, and I read a couple more translations. And I'd already been thinking about trying to find something to adapt into a play. And I immediately, I think even the first time that I read it, I thought, well, this is a monologue. This is largely just one person speaking and telling his story. And so the more I thought about it, I thought, well, I should adapt this into a play. It's been fascinating to me. It was a text that I could not stop thinking about, and I thought I think other people will think the same thing. And so I tested it. I would like go up to somebody at a party. I was like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this show, and it's based on Ecclesiastes. Like, would you come see that? And they're like, well, that sounds kind of weird, but sure, I'd come see it. And so after the field research, I thought, I've got to do this. And then I turned it into a show. And I think I've done it in 8 or 9 different cities now, and have just talked with so many cool people about not only my show, but the text that it's based on.
So I'd love to hear a little more about some of the reactions you've gotten to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as somebody who's familiar with Ecclesiastes, as I know you are, because I've now read your book. So there's the proof is in the book, that you know what you're talking about. I mean, there's a lot of statements that could be arguably contradictory or just on the surface, even though they're so simple, um, they're not what we traditionally talk about today, or they're ideas that are sort of hard to digest. And so one of the reasons I wanted to turn this into a play is I thought if I can find this guy, if I can find a personality that fits all of these statements together and perform them in a logical way that's believable, just like any other play, you're trying to bring these characters to life. I thought if I can do this and make all these things kind of like fit together in a way, I think it's going to start a lot of really interesting conversations. And that's definitely been the case. Um, because the things that we say, the conversations that we have, we don't always have the same idea on different days, or our opinions of things might be fluid. And so putting them into a show like this kind of brings them together and shows how human this book really is, in the point of view that Kohelet has. And so back to your question about the reactions, I've had very religious people and ministers, and I've had ministers who were skeptical about, that thought that maybe the treatment of the text was not going to be, was what might be disrespectful. And they came up to me after the show and said, "Wow, I've never thought about this book this way before. I'm going to be thinking about this all day." I've had multiple like pastors or preachers that have come and said that after they bought the ticket to the show, that they planned their sermon right before they saw the show on Ecclesiastes so that they could familiarize themselves with the text again. And and then they came to the show and they were so taken off guard by just how natural it was, and just how funny it can be sometimes, in the context of the show. So I've had those conversations, but I think some of the most meaningful have been, people that don't interact with scripture all that much on a regular basis, maybe people who have had the words of the Bible used against them. I say at the intro to the show, to judge them or condemn them. It makes people resistant to even want to listen to scripture at all, even in an entertaining show, because the show is just, I mean, for the most part, is just verbatim the scripture interpreted for the stage. Um, but I've had people come up afterward and thank me and say, I really didn't feel like the Bible was mine anymore. I left church for this or that, and I really haven't been able to engage with the Bible, but I love it. And thank you so much. It felt so good to hear these words in a safe environment, in such a heartfelt way. And so those have been cool conversations to have as well.
That really connects with the reason that I've always loved this book so much, is because Kohelet is a questioner. And I find that a lot of my students, especially the gen ed students who didn't really want to take a religion class but had to, they can connect with this book because Kohelet is a questioner. And then they feel this kind of liberation to say, oh, wait, we're allowed to question, we're allowed to ask about life's injustices and things like that. So I think that's something that so many people can engage with. I just wanted to ask one other thing in terms of the facial expressions, and that is, did you find yourself struggling much with how to pull off a certain aphorism, phrase, little vignette in terms, I mean, I can think it could go so many ways.
Yeah, well, struggle, it was a challenge. I wouldn't say a struggle, but it was a challenge. But it's one that my theater background has really kind of prepared me to take the challenge, because if any old script, even Shakespeare, I know everybody talks about, Shakespeare has these great plays, but they're very difficult to interpret in the, 2023. And so you have to go into the text and you have to say, okay, audience, modern audiences don't know what this means, or I don't know what this means. Nobody knows what this means anymore. So what do we do with that? How do we give it meaning? I know the show's called Meaningless, but it's actually the opposite. That's the conundrum. But so what we did in the rehearsal process, is if we got stuck, we would just try it this way. And it's like, well, maybe if he says it like this, maybe that will make sense. And so there's moments in the show, some of the things, this character in the play, he just says them off the top of his head. These are his stories and his beliefs. This is the advice that he's given everybody for decades. And then some of them he actually reads from the book of Ecclesiastes. I have a paperback book, and he opens it up because they do kind of, they're non sequiturs in a way, and they're just lists of aphorisms. And so he reads them, and he kind of responds to what he thinks about that aphorism together with the audience, which makes it theatrical in a way that just reading the text doesn't do. So that was one of the many solutions we made. And then we also came up with this idea in this translation, which is the New Living Translation, is what we use. He calls himself the teacher. Again, I, the teacher, I, the teacher. And so we kind of made him almost this traveling music teacher, kind of a la Harold Hill and the Music Man. It's not a direct reference, but we took that kind of an idea of, he's got this bag of teaching tools that he takes with him to illustrate all these points that he's going to make. And so that was another way that we sort of made all of this work together and made kind of this believable character out of sometimes these sentences that don't necessarily uh, flow together.
That's so funny. I never thought of Harold Hill. It made me think of a traveling bard.
Yeah,
Ellen Kushner has this book, Thomas the Rhymer, about this bard who goes around teaching stories, telling stories. And I think that's so fitting for the biblical text. Well, I
yeah.
can't wait to see it again and bring
I'm
all my
excited for you to see it
students.
again.
And I wish I was in Oklahoma City so I too could see it. It sounds like a really great show. Thank you both for taking the time to chat about this. Um, really appreciate it. For those of you out there who have not yet heard or read about this show, there will be some links below you can click on. In the video description, we will have the link to Lisa's article in the Christian Century about her reaction to the show as a biblical scholar who studied the text. We'll also have a link where you can learn about where it's being performed and buy tickets if you're able to make it to one of the performances. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.